So, okay, we're back. The recording is going again, and we are live again. Just a few minutes later here. Okay, so we're up to I would say the midway point as far as the really interesting content is concerned. There's some other stuff in here too that you can kind of follow along with if you like. But for me, I think this is. Hi again, Matthew. Oh man, it's so great to have people in the chat. This is wonderful. It feels real. But okay, so let's go ahead and let's just jump right back in here. She says, as we have seen, if the oppressor were aware of the demands of his own freedom. Actually, I should switch the layout back. Okay, there we go. Now you can kind of follow along if you want to. Okay, if the oppressor were aware of the demands of his own freedom, he himself should have to denounce oppression, right? So there's this sense in which anyone who oppresses someone else is saying, my will, not your will. You should work to execute my will, and help me figure out my goals and so on and so forth. And that limits the freedom of the person being oppressed for the simple reason that time, and this goes back to Hegel again, but that time could be spent, if you're oppressing me, I have things I would rather be doing than being oppressed. She says, but he is dishonest in the name of the serious, or of his passions, or of his will for power, or of his appetites. He refuses to give up his privileges. In order for a liberating action to be a thoroughly moral action, it would have to be achieved through a conversion of the oppressors. Then there would be a reconciliation of all freedoms. But no one any longer dares to abandon himself today to these utopian reveries. We know only too well that we cannot count upon a collective conversion. However, by virtue of the fact that oppressors refuse to cooperate in the affirmation of freedom, they embody in the eyes of all men of goodwill the absurdity of facticity. And facticity is just another Heideggerian word. It's like sort of the beingness of a fact. So factfulness or something might be sort of a synonym there that you could use if that word's unfamiliar. But when she talks about the absurdity of it, as she's an existentialist as well, she's making a significantly more complex point than you might assume that she was making just by reading this little clause here. Facticity is absurd because, in some sense, things don't matter, people matter. And yet, facticity is extremely important because all of our choices are based to some extent or another, hopefully quite a bit, on the facts that we understand and take into account when we make them. So she says, by calling for the triumph of freedom over facticity, ethics also demands that they be suppressed. And since their subjectivity, by definition, escapes our control, it will be possible to act only on their objective presence. Others here will have to be treated like things with violence. The sad fact of the separation of men will thereby be confirmed. Thus, here is the oppressor oppressed in turn, and the men who do violence to him, in their turn, become masters, tyrants, and executioners. In revolting, the oppressed are metamorphosed into a blind force, a brutal fatality. The evil which divides the world is carried out in their own hearts. And doubtless it is not a question of backing out of these consequences, for the ill will of the oppressor imposes upon each one the alternative of being the enemy of the oppressed if he is not that of their tyrant. Evidently, it is necessary to choose to sacrifice the one who is an enemy of man. But the fact that one finds himself forced to treat certain men as things in order to win the freedom of all. So when we look at this section heading here, it's called the Antinomies of Action. And what an antinomy is, aside from being a relatively difficult word to say, actually goes back to Kant. Okay, so for Kant, a couple hundred years ago, the concept of an antinomy was used to sort of prove that rationality is not necessarily identical with the world that we're using it to sort of manipulate these abstract concepts about. So when we see this term antinomy in Kant, what he then does is he gives a conclusion and he gives arguments for and against it. And in both cases, he works to make sure that the argument for the conclusion, say God exists or whatever, is valid and sound. So it's a good, strong argument. And then he pivots and he argues the reverse of what he has just argued. And the antinomy is the inability that we have to decide between these two equal, both valid, both sound, both strong arguments, and choose whether to believe the conclusion is true or false. So when you see both sides of something like that, what you're looking at is an antinomy. And here we find that the fact is that one finds himself forced to treat certain men as things in order to win the freedom of all. This is an inherent limitation of the revolution. Beauvoir and certainly Sartre were definitely people who were interested in something like a communist revolution. And they wanted this because it seemed the best way to sort of enable more people to take on the mantle of freedom. And that seemed like a good thing to them. I mean, obviously, it has to. It's kind of the point. But in order to win the war, so to speak, you have to allow people to be sacrificed. And that involves treating certain men as things. And so Beauvoir Beauvoir here is being very upfront about that fact. And I wonder again about the pivot that we were talking to earlier. We weren't talking to the pivot. We were talking about the pivot from sort of the revolution as the revolt against humans to technology as the revolt against nature. And I think that's something that's happened after Beauvoir wrote this book, probably, even more quickly in the past decade, maybe 2 decades here. But really, I think the interesting meat of this book is that there is a certain sense in which it positions us to very sharply sort of understand where we're at today. But by seeing where we were in the past and just seeing the clarity of Beauvoir's prose here. She says down here, when a young 16-year-old Nazi died crying, "Hail Hitler," he was not guilty. It was not he whom we hated, but his masters. The desirable thing to do would be to re-educate this misled youth. It would be necessary to expose the mystification and to put the men who are its victims in the presence of their freedom. But the urgency of the struggle forbids this slow labor. We are obliged to destroy not only the oppressor, but also those who serve him, whether they do so out of ignorance or out of constraint. And that really is unfortunate. That's a very real shortcoming of revolutionary war, right? I mean, she goes on, she says, "As we have also seen, the situation of the world is so complex that one cannot fight everywhere at the same time and for everyone. In order to win an urgent victory, one has to give up the idea, at least temporarily, of serving certain valid causes. One may even be brought to the point of fighting against them. Thus, during the course of the last war, no anti-fascist could have wanted the revolts of the natives in the British Empire to be successful. On the contrary, those revolts were supported by the fascist regimes. And yet we cannot blame those who, considering their emancipation to be the more urgent action, took advantage of the situation to obtain it. Thus it is possible, and often it even happens, that one finds himself obliged to oppress and kill men who are pursuing goals whose validity one acknowledges himself." So, I mean, this is the equivalent of, watching Star Wars and seeing the rebels have to fight each other. It's unfortunate. It's not something that you want to see. What is it, Rogue One, I guess, where there's that guy, Saul Guevara or whatever, and Jyn Erso has to go, get shelter from him. But he's not really. He's sort of has like a competing rebel alliance, and they all of course get murdered in the film and everything. But you really do feel sad for them, because the protagonists that you've been sort of brought up to support in these movies, the Rebel Alliance, they're not enemies with one another. They're not opponents of one another. They're not friends, and they're not necessarily allies. But you're still sad to kind of see them go, because they seem to be fighting for a worthwhile cause and everything. So yeah, I mean, violence is just it's intensely and deeply problematic for us. She says, but that is not the worst thing to be said for violence. It not only forces us to sacrifice the men who are in our way, but also those who are fighting on our side, and even ourselves. Since we can conquer our enemies only by acting upon their facticity, by reducing them to things, we have to make ourselves things. In this struggle in which wills are forced to confront each other throughout their bodies, the bodies of our allies, like those of our opponents, are exposed to the same brutal hazard. They will be wounded, killed, or starved. Every war, every revolution, demands the sacrifice of a generation of collectivity by those who undertake it. I mean, war is terrible. This isn't good. So I think we can kind of continue to move through this and to pay close attention to it, but for some reason this seems a little bit less relevant to me personally than some of the things that we talked about earlier. And as I think about why that is, I just keep coming back to this, twin structure of revolution. You have maybe nature on one hand to be rebelled against, human beings on the other hand to be rebelled against, and maybe what we're trying to do is as a species right now is to eliminate some of the conflict between humans by directing our energy towards nature and sort of solving some of the problems that we've got there. So that's kind of why this isn't as depressing to me today as it could be some other day, right? She says, the trick of tyrants is to enclose a man in the immanence of his facticity, and to try to forget that man is always, as Heidegger puts it, infinitely more than what he would be if he were reduced to being what he is. Man is a being of the distances, a movement toward the future, a project. This is so important, because you can't define a man. Man is you can't define man without talking about options, without talking about possibilities, without talking about things that might or might not be. And so what we do when we have to fight a man and we need to be able to dehumanize him is we strip that away from him, and we make it to where it seems like he is a thing. We went through this a little bit earlier. And I mean, yeah, this is just, I mean, it's a really sharp exegesis of sort of the nastiest part of the underside of the human psyche, right? I mean, you don't want to think about the Rebel Alliance in Star Wars as thinking of themselves and their enemies as things, right? That is just, there's something gross about that. And yet, we kind of set that aside when we sit down and watch the movies, don't we? Anyway, I'll let that go for the moment. She says, the essential moment of Hegelian ethics is the moment when consciousnesses recognize one another. In this operation, the other is recognized as identical with me, which means that in myself, it is the universal truth of myself which alone is recognized. So individuality is denied, and it can no longer reappear except on the natural and contingent plane. Moral salvation will lie in my surpassing toward that other who is equal to myself, and who in turn will surpass himself toward another. Hegel himself recognizes that if this passage continued indefinitely, totality would never be achieved. The real would peter out in the same measure. One cannot, without absurdity, indefinitely sacrifice each generation to the following one. Human history would then only be an endless succession of negations, which would never return to the positive. All action would be destruction, and life would be a vain flight. We must admit that there will be a recovery of the real, and that all sacrifices will find their positive form within the absolute mind. But this does not work without some difficulty. The mind is a subject, but who is a subject? After Descartes, we can ignore the fact that subjectivity radically signifies, or how can we ignore the part that subjectivity radically signifies separation? And if it is admitted at the cost of a contradiction that the subject will be the men of the future reconciled, it must be clearly recognized that the men of today who turn out to have been the substance of the real and not subjects remain excluded forever from this reconciliation. So, I mean, I don't want to, if any kids are watching, I don't want to swear or anything, but, I mean, forget Hegel, right? She just completely rips him a new one here. I mean, the whole project of sort of Hegel's closed loop of history that enabled so much fascistic thinking and so many totalitarian trends to sort of emerge is just completely eviscerated here. I mean, wow. So Hegel's entire metaphysics is essentially impossible. She's maybe taken a few scraps from it to sort of build her own construct here with. But I mean, she has just completely destroyed any possibility, much like Karl Popper does, of Hegel being a legitimate philosophical place or person or creator. Furthermore, she says, even Hegel retreats from the idea of this motionless future. Since mind is restlessness, the dialectic of struggle and conciliation can never be stopped. The future which it envisages is not the perfect peace of Kant, but an indefinite state of war. It declares that this war will no longer appear as a temporary evil in which each individual makes a gift of himself to the state, but it is precisely at this point that there is a bit of sleight of hand. For why would he agree to this gift, since the state cannot be the achieving of the real, totality recovering itself? The whole system seems like a huge mystification, since it subordinates all its moments to an end whose coming it dares not set up. The individual renounces himself, but no reality in favor of which he can renounce himself is ever affirmed or recovered. I mean, yeah. I mean, if the individual is nothing, society cannot be something. I believe it was up a little bit where she talks about the individuals being zeros, and 0 plus 0 is still 0. So you can justify the end of an entire society if they make you unhappy by reducing them to subhumans in your mind, right? And I mean, this is more just destruction of Hegel, which I mean is phenomenal, and I'm quite entertained by it. But let's kind of keep moving because it's been a long time and we've still got quite a ways to go. She says, from conservatives to revolutionaries, through idealistic and moral vocabularies or realistic and positive ones, the outrageousness of violence is excused in the name of utility. It does not much matter that the action is not fatally commanded by the anterior events as long as it is called for by the proposed end. This end sets up the means which are subordinated to it, and thanks to this subordination, one can perhaps not avoid sacrifice, but one can legitimize it. This is what is important to the man of action. Like Saint Just, he accepts the loss of his innocence. It is the arbitrariness of the crime which is repugnant to him more than the crime itself. Oh. And moving on just a little bit, she says, but is the cause of man that of each man? That is what utilitarian ethics has been striving to demonstrate since Hegel. If one wishes to give the word useful a universal and absolute meaning, it is always a question of reabsorbing each man into the bosom of mankind. It is said that despite the weaknesses of the flesh and that particular fear which each one experiences in the face of his particular death, the real interest of each one is mingled with the general interest. And it is true that each is bound to all, but that is precisely the ambiguity of the condition. In his surpassing towards others, each one exists absolutely as for himself. Each is interested in the liberation of all, but as a separate existence engaged in his own projects. So much so that the terms useful to man, useful to this man, do not overlap. It's interesting. Useful to man and useful to this man. I mean, the particularity of useful to this man admits of there's a thisness there, Hegel would call that sense certainty. That's talking about the particular in terms of the particular. And I guess useful to man in general would be something that was far less general. That would be, or far more general. That would be something like a principle. There would be, it would be like food is useful to man in general. But the concept of food that's useful to the concept of man, as we sort of create this, I guess, simulacrum of mankind and the general principles that serve that. Yeah, I mean that. I don't know. I still do kind of want to push against that, but we can let it go for now. Okay, she says here, one generally takes numerical considerations into account by a strange compromise which clearly shows that every action treats men both as a means and as an end, as an external object and as an inwardness. It is better to save the lives of 10 men than of only one. Thus, one treats man as an end, for to set up quantity as a value is to set up the positive value of each unit. But it is setting it up as a quantifiable value, thus as an externality. I have known a Kantian rationalist who passionately maintained that it is as immoral to choose the death of a single man as to let 10,000 die. He was right in the sense that in each murder, the outrage is total. 10,000 dead, there are never 10,000 copies of a single death. No multiplication is relevant to subjectivity. But he forgot that for the one who has the decision to make, men are given, nevertheless, as objects that can be counted. It is therefore logical that though this logic implies an outrageous absurdity, to prefer the salvation of the greater number. Moreover, this problem is rather abstract, for one rarely bases a choice on pure quantity. I want to dwell on this, and I want to read this to everyone who's ever taken an ethics class in the university, because I think the trend these days is to teach what they call normative ethics, and they use like the Trolley Problem and all these different things that are basically designed to show that maybe you're not as certain as you think you are, that some of these basic principles are sort of right on the money, the way that we intuitively would expect them to be. But here Beauvoir just, I mean, basically she met a guy like that and just really thought that maybe he was missing something pretty basic there. I kind of wonder who it was. I wonder if this Kantian rationalist became famous and maybe has written or done something that we would have known him from, or her, I suppose. But yeah, so there's this this objectification of people that definitely, to the Kantian rationalist point, There's this way in which we objectify people that doesn't seem to precisely admit of quantification. It's about the particular possibilities that seem relevant for the people that we're looking at there, right? If you're looking at the trolley problem, and the traditional setup is you've got a trolley that's coming, you've got a lever here, if you pull the lever, it'll change the track, but there's 5 people chained to the second track that it'll switch to if you pull the lever, and there's only 1 person chained to the track where the trolley's going to go if you do nothing. So do you do nothing, or wait? I guess the 5 and the 1 are reversed. So the 5 are going to get hit no matter what. But if you pull the lever, then you'll have caused the 1 person to die. And I think I think it's certainly got its place. I used to argue against doing ethics in this way because it seemed so counterproductive. To just sort of put people in these puzzles, because why? Like there's no reason to focus on those particular things, right? It's ethics. It's the study of behavior. We could talk about anything we wanted to, and yet we've got like sort of these little abstract like kind of mind games going on instead of deeper, higher level conversations that we could be having. But let's go ahead and just move on a little bit, because I think that section was very long, but it was very long because it was really full of great content. Action is something that it's never free, and it can fail. And if it fails, it's going to be bad for us, straight up. So we need to admit that and understand that, and then figure out what to do anyway. And so that sort of is the birthplace of this concept of freedom that Beauvoir finds to be just so unbelievably central to what ethics is, right? Like if ethics is about something, then what ethics is about is that freedom to make that choice. Right, okay, so in those antinomies, what we saw is that there was a tension between what seems like the right thing to do and what maybe would be the best thing to do. I've kind of lost my train of thought here, haven't I? Maybe I should drink more coffee. Yeah, that's good stuff. But okay, so if we're looking at this section here, and we're trying to just sum it up with a sentence or two and say what the antinomies of action are. The funny thing about it is that it doesn't really necessarily sum up all that well, does it? We're talking about the conflict between individual people and their individual wills and their individual desires, and then we're also talking about sort of the larger things, the cause, so to speak, and why that turns out to be actually at odds with individual people so frequently. And now we're looking at the present and the future. This ought to be good. The word future has 2 meanings corresponding to the 2 aspects of the ambiguous condition of man, which is lack of being and which is existence. It alludes to both being and existence. When I envisage my future, I consider that movement which, prolonging my existence of today, will fulfill my present projects and will surpass them toward new ends. The future is the definite direction of a particular transcendence, and it is so closely bound up with the present that it composes with it a single temporal form. This is the future which Heidegger considered as a reality, which is given at each moment. But through the centuries, men have dreamed of another future in which it might be granted them to retrieve themselves as beings in glory, happiness, or justice. This future did not prolong the present. It came down upon the world like a cataclysm, announced by signs which cut the continuity of time, by a Messiah, by meteors, by the trumpets of the Last Judgment. By transporting the kingdom of God to heaven, Christians have almost stripped it of its temporal character, although it was proposed to the believer only at the end of his life. It was the anti-Christian humanism of the 18th century which brought the myth down to earth again. Then, through the idea of progress, an idea of the future was elaborated in which its two aspects fused. The future appeared both as the meaning of our transcendence and as the immobility of being. It is human, terrestrial, and the resting place of things. It is in this form that it is hesitantly reflected in the systems of Hegel and of Comte. I'm actually not all that familiar with Comte. Let's see. It is in this form that it is so often invoked today as a unity of the world or as a finished socialist state. In both cases, the future appears as both the infinite and as totality, as number and as unity of conciliation. It is the abolition of the negative. It is fullness, happiness. One might surmise that any sacrifice already made might be claimed in its name. However great the quantity of men sacrificed today, the quantity that will profit by their sacrifice is infinitely greater. On the other hand, in the face of the positivity of the future, the present is only the negative, which much... Wow, I'm really getting bad at reading all of a sudden. I guess maybe my limit for doing this is about 2 hours or so. Maybe an hour and a half. Well, let's try and kind of keep going here. The present is the transitory existence which is made in order to be abolished. It retrieves itself only by transcending itself toward the permanence of future being. It is only as an instrument, as a means. It is only by its efficacy with regard to the coming of the future that the present is validly realized. Reduced to itself, it is nothing. One may dispose of it as he pleases. And that's some pretty interesting stuff, isn't it? When we're talking about the future, we're talking about the moment that we're sort of building up to. It's like freedom involving a goal, right? You choose your goal, and then you execute something and kind of take notes about the outcome, maybe might be like one way of sort of looking at it. And so the future, in that sort of a model, isn't really something that is... it's not... Well, maybe a better way of putting it is that the goal of the present always is to modify something such that it will modify, or such that the future will be rendered more predictable. And so here we've got sort of this monstrous overestimation of the predictability of the future that I guess Comte was up to, and that Hegel most definitely was someone who sort of perpetrated, right? And the thing is that, and this is a point that Nietzsche made, I believe, which is just don't give up the present in service of some sort of a future, right? It doesn't justify all of this suffering. It doesn't, right? Like the sacrifices aren't actually, equal here. We've lost by sacrificing all these people to this future. And if there had been a better way, then that would have been the thing to do there, right? So you can't just, as she did to Hegel earlier, during the section at the end of the ambiguity of action, where she just completely decimates this concept that there's this project of history, which was so central to the Hegelian worldview that she was going after there. The future as sort of this undefined thing that you're supposed to be scared of and that you're supposed to be saving for or whatever is kind of the same way. It's yeah. Okay, so I'm just going to move on here. She says the fundamental ambiguity of the human condition will always open up to men the possibility of opposing choices. There will always be within them the desire to be that being of whom they have made themselves a lack. The flight from the anguish of freedom, the plane of hell, of struggle, will never be eliminated. Freedom will never be given. It will always have to be won. That is what Trotsky was saying when he envisaged the future as a permanent revolution. Thus, there is a fallacy hidden in that abusive language which all parties make use of today to justify their politics when they declare that the world is still at war. If one means that the struggle is not over, that the world is a prey to opposed interests which affront each other violently, he is speaking the truth. But he also means that such a situation is abnormal and calls for abnormal behavior. The politics that it involves can impugn every moral principle, since it has only a provisional form. Later on, we shall act in accordance with truth and justice. To the idea of present war, there is opposed that of a future peace, when man will find again, along with a stable situation, the possibility of a morality. But the truth is that if division and violence define war, the world has always been at war and always will be. If man is waiting for universal peace in order to establish his existence validly, he will wait indefinitely. There will never be any other future. Wow. Yeah, I mean, pay close attention to your politicians, folks. Don't let them ramrod you down some trail you don't want to take. I mean, the consequences can be serious. I don't know. I mean, I'm American, so I've been in the United States watching us be continuously at war since 2001, and I mean, there are certain things in this book that are just they just kind of weigh on me, you know, and it's a real effort to not try to kind of block those out and just sort of bubble cut around them. But okay, so let's check this one out. We are aware that the whole world is interested in each of our undertakings, and this spatial enlargement of our projects also governs their temporal dimension by a paradoxical symmetry. Whereas an individual accords great value to one day of his life, and a city to 1 year, the interests of the world are computed in centuries. The greater the human density that one envisages, the more the viewpoint of externality wins over that of internality. And the idea of externality carries with it that of quantity. Thus the scales of measurement have changed. Space and time have expanded about us. Today it is a small matter that 1 million men in a century seem to us only a provisional moment. Yet the individual is not touched by this transformation. His life keeps the same rhythm. His death does not retreat before him. He extends his control of the world by instruments which enable him to devour distances and to multiply the output of his effort in time. But he is always only one. However, instead of accepting his limits, he tries to do away with them. So we're back to our technology motif here. Let's see. We've already kind of addressed that to some extent. And this is a little bit, I don't know, this might be pretty interesting actually. I do still kind of want to skip it, but basically what we're talking about here is some pretty central stuff to Sartre, who was somebody who was very close to de Beauvoir. Yeah, and we've got science and history and stuff here. But to me it seems like the important part of this section has already kind of taken place, and just, you know, this concept here again. He must regard his undertakings as finite and will them absolutely. So again, understanding and freedom, right? Understanding is good because we have finite time, finite resources, and there are a finite number of things that we can accomplish, and we need to make choices about how to do that. And freedom is necessary because nobody's going to be you for you, right? It goes back to the example I gave the other day of the band that has maybe a song that's not a number one hit, but they still have to play it with passion. And that's that's how you should think of your life if we're distilling this principle out of de Beauvoir and deciding that it's correct, right? I mean, nobody's going to live your life for you, so you need to do it, and you need to do it confidently and consistently and the best that you can. And so there's this tension between the understanding that you're not perfect and yet the imperative conferred upon us by action that we will each thing that we do, as she says here, absolutely, because a lot of things that we do are going to fail if we don't believe in them, right? So there's this need for belief, for free action to take place in the first place, and that's that sounds right to me. I hope that sounds right to you too, because I don't really know how else you could sort of view that. And then here's the last chunk for section 4 here. As for us, the goal must be considered as an end. We have to justify it on the basis of our freedom, which has projected it, by the ensemble of movement which ends in its fulfillment. The tasks we have set up for ourselves, in which, though exceeding the limits of our lives, are ours, must find their meaning in themselves, and not in a mythical historical end. Boom. I mean, shots fired, Hegel. What are you going to do, bro? Okay, so section 5 here is ambiguity, and as you recall, the book is called Ethics of Ambiguity. So this is, I believe, the last section that comes before the conclusion, and this is going to be where Beauvoir is going to kind of finish summing up everything that she's had to say here, which, I mean, honestly, it's a shocking amount for such a short book. I mean, hey, say what you will, she was extremely concise, and that generally reflects a high level of understanding of what you're communicating here. So she says, the notion of ambiguity must not be confused with that of absurdity. To declare that existence is absurd is to deny that it can ever be given a meaning. To say that it is ambiguous is to assert that its meaning is never fixed, that it must be constantly one. So again, Camus, absurdity. And what is absurdity? There's a logical argument style that's known as reductio ad absurdum, which is where you assume the truth of something someone is trying to say and draw a conclusion based upon that that would logically follow, and by demonstrating the falsity of this necessary outcome of the truth of the principle that they're trying to argue for, you can actually show that the principle must not be true. And that's sort of what absurdity really is. It's this tendency for contradictions to happen. So when we use an antinomy to sort of point out that it is two ways, what we're looking at there is absurdity at the end of the day. I mean, we're looking at the conflict between two conclusions that contradict one another. And so absurd isn't always the way to think of ethics, right? Yeah. So to declare that existence is absurd is to deny that it can ever be given a meaning. And so what she means there is that you can never say anything that isn't contradicted by something else about existence if you believe that existence is absurd. To say that it's ambiguous is to assert that meaning is never fixed, that it must be constantly one. So instead of it being both ways, no matter which way you try to slice it, it's neither way. And that's a significant difference, because absurdity doesn't allow for any sort of openness or any sort of creativity that can allow us to sort of take charge of our lives, so to speak. Whereas ambiguity does. It does give us that opportunity to to seize our own freedom and act in the world as we see fit. She says, absurdity challenges every ethics, but also the finished rationalization of the real would leave no room for ethics. And it's because man's condition is ambiguous that he seeks, through failure and outrageousness, to save his existence. Thus, to say that action has to be lived in its truth, that is, in the consciousness of the antinomies which it involves, does not mean that one has to renounce it. So you have to believe in yourself. You don't have to stop doing things. I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. She says, art and science do not establish themselves despite failure, but through it, which does not prevent there being truths and errors, masterpieces and lemons, depending upon whether the discovery of the painting has or has not known how to win the adherence of human consciousness. This amounts to saying that failure, always ineluctable, is in certain cases spared and in others not. So we don't know a formula that creates a successful artwork every time. It is the nature of art itself that failure is ineluctable and that we're spared of it sometimes, but not always. I think that's as good a way of putting it as I've ever seen anyone do. And then down here we've got the resistance did not aspire to a... Oh yeah, this is more revolutionary stuff. Yeah, liberation is aimed not at... Since the liberation aimed at is not a thing situated in an unfamiliar time, but a movement which realizes itself by tending to conquer, it cannot attain itself if it denies itself at the start. Action cannot seek to fulfill itself by means which would destroy its very meaning. And yeah, I mean, this is the same type of thing that we've been talking about all along, except framed in terms of politics here. She says, today, more or less consciously in the name of such an ethics, we condemn a magistrate who handed over a communist to save 10 hostages, and along with him all the Vichy'ites who were trying to make the best of things. It was not a matter of rationalizing the present such as it was imposed by German occupation, but of rejecting it unconditionally. The resistance did not aspire to a positive effectiveness. It was a negation, a revolt, a martyrdom. And in this negative movement, freedom was positively and absolutely confirmed. Yeah, so they won their freedom. That's good. Okay. Yeah, and here's a good chunk here. All right, what do we want to do here? Okay, as for the revolutionary humanism, it accepts only rarely the tension of permanent liberation. It has created a church where salvation is bought by membership in a party, as it is bought elsewhere by baptism and indulgences. We have seen that this recourse to the serious is a lie. I don't think that should say he. Is a lie. It entails the sacrifice of the man to the thing, of freedom to the cause. In order for the return to the positive to be genuine, it must involve negativity. It must not conceal the antinomies between means and end, present and future. They must be lived in a permanent tension. One must retreat from neither the outrage of violence nor deny it, which amounts to the same thing. Assume it lightly. Oh, and yeah, now we've got a Kierkegaard reference, so that was definitely on point earlier when we were talking about that. Yeah, so I mean, basically, if a revolution is real, you're not going to find the people lying about stuff. If it's still healthy and if it's going well, which I'm just not really. I don't know. I think one of the biggest conflicts and one of the biggest sources of tension that we have as a people, as a species, even today, is precisely the widespread availability of information, the rapid flows of information that create these sort of whirlwinds, right? I mean, if you look at something like QAnon, I mean, it's not like the message is really true or false. It's more that there's like this constant stream of shit that kind of sucks people in, and they get kind of trapped by it, right? And I wonder, what might be done to sort of the structure of this work, to sort of the ethical frameworks structure, that is, that might sort of shine some light on present day conflicts that involve, in particular, technology. But I'll muse on that on my own time here. It says, it will be said that these considerations remain quite abstract. What must be done practically? Which action is good? Which is bad? To ask such a question is also to fall into a naive abstraction. We don't ask the physicist which hypotheses are true, nor the artist by which procedures does one produce a work whose beauty is guaranteed. Ethics does not furnish recipes any more than do science and art. One can merely propose methods. Yeah, and you can learn methods, but the method doesn't contain its own object in it, right? You can do what you want with the method once you've figured out how to do it, right? I mean, just look at what we're doing right now. I'm streaming this on Twitch. This isn't a game. So I mean, the method was created and developed by the creators of Twitch for a certain purpose, but that purpose can coexist with whatever purpose I bring as a free individual to my interaction with it, right? Yeah. So analogously, one may say that in the case where the content of action falsifies its meaning, one must not modify the meaning. One must modify not the meaning, which is here willed absolutely, but the content itself. However, it is impossible to determine this relationship between meaning and content abstractly and universally. There must be a trial and decision in each case. But likewise, just as the physicist finds it profitable to reflect on the conditions of scientific invention, and the artist on those of artistic creation without expecting any ready-made solutions to come from these reflections, it is useful for the man of action to find out under what conditions his undertakings are valid. We're going to see that on this basis, new perspectives are disclosed. And that's the whole point, right? I mean, the whole goal here is sort of the protection and maintenance of, you might say, like this wellspring of novelty, which is the individual's ability to approach the world and come up with something new, to create something. And so there is, in some sense, a very tangible good for Beauvoir here. And when she talks about what's good, she doesn't do the thing that Aristotle and Plato and everybody did and try to define it. What she does is she looks for the place that it comes from and sort of erects these... I don't know if that's the right word, because, I mean, walls and... I mean, it's just not the right image. But she defends it, she protects it. And she doesn't define or constrain it by so doing, which is just a fascinating accomplishment. I mean, it's really amazing. Yeah. But okay, so however, it must not be forgotten that there's a concrete bond between freedom and existence. To will man free is to will there to be being. It is to will the disclosure of being and the joy of existence. In order for the idea of liberation to have a concrete meaning, the joy of existence must be asserted in each one at every instant. The movement toward freedom assumes its real flesh and blood figure in the world by thickening into pleasure, into happiness. That's fascinating. I wrote an essay earlier this year about Aristotle and his concept of eudaimonia, I believe is a better pronunciation there. And it actually turned into a book called Bring Back Satire that I put out on Amazon. And so I've spent a little bit of time thinking about happiness, you might say, since the pandemic started. And I'm so fascinated by this concept here. The movement toward freedom assumes its real flesh and blood figure in the world by thickening into pleasure, into happiness. If we do not love life on our own account and through others, it is futile to seek to justify it in any way. The saving of time and the conquest of leisure have no meaning if we are not moved by the laugh of a child at play. I mean, powerful stuff, really. Let's see. That's kind of a defense of the concept that we're working on here in Ethics of Ambiguity. I don't think we really need to emphasize that right now. I mean, honestly, she has just crushed this. This is a really solid book. She says, we object to the inquisitors who want to create faith and virtue from without. We object to all forms of fascism which seek to fashion the happiness of man from without. And also the paternalism which thinks it has done something for man by prohibiting him from certain possibilities of temptation, whereas what is necessary is to give him reasons for resisting it. That's an interesting point, too. I mean, oftentimes paternalism leads to a revolt. Everybody's heard of the kid who gets out of their parents' house for the first time and moves into the dorm at college, and suddenly the most straight-laced high school student is now the craziest college student that you've ever seen. I mean, yeah, and so there just almost has to be, to some extent, some sort of concrete something here. And I think Beauvoir has done a great job with that. I'm planning to do one more video here that'll involve just sort of a reflection across the entire work, though, and I'll talk more about that in that video. First, let's go ahead and kind of finish looking through these last couple of pages here. She says, one might first wonder for whom we are seeking freedom and happiness. When raised in this way, the problem is abstract. The answer will, therefore, be arbitrary, and the arbitrary always involves outrage. It is not entirely the fault of the... I'm not super worried about that, actually. I think she's already made her point here. She says, for whom are we seeking freedom and happiness? And I think the answer to that has to be for ourselves, right? She says down here, we can only indicate a method here. The first point is always to consider what genuine human interest fills the abstract form which one proposes the actions in. Politics always puts forward ideas, nation, empire, union, economy, whatever, but none of these forms has value in itself. It has it only insofar as it involves concrete individuals. If a nation can assert itself proudly only to the detriment of its members, if a union can be created only to the detriment of those it is trying to unite, the nation or the union must be rejected. We repudiate all ideas, mysticisms, etc., which prefer a form to man himself. But the matter becomes really agonizing when it is a question of a cause which genuinely serves man. That is why the question of Stalinist politics the problem of the relationship of the party to the masses, which it uses in order to serve them, in the forefront of the preoccupations of all men of goodwill. However, there are very few who raise it without dishonesty, and we must first try to dispel a few fallacies. The opponent of the USSR is making use of a fallacy when emphasizing the part of criminal violence assumed by Stalinist politics. He neglects to confront it with the ends pursuit. Doubtless the purges, the deportations, the abuses of the occupation, and the police dictatorship surpass in importance the violences practiced by any other country. The very fact that there are 160 million inhabitants in Russia multiplies the numerical coefficient of the injustices committed. But these quantitative considerations are insufficient. I mean, honestly speaking, I think we've kind of already seen what there is to see here. And I'm not super interested in reading about a take on Russia from 1948, because a lot of that has kind of changed. But I believe that the point that she is making is that you can't put what you want to create for man in such a position as to be privileged above man himself. And there are all kinds of examples of that You know, I don't know. I'm trying to think of an example like a movie or a book or something, and I'm having kind of a tough time doing it. So let's just let that go for now. The point that she's going to make here at the end is actually super cool. She says, but the idea of a total dialectic history. Yeah, we're back to talking about history in the Hegelian sense, which means she's already pretty much disemboweled. Like, she says, so it is apparent that the method we are proposing, analogous in this respect to scientific or aesthetic methods, consists in each case of confronting the values realized with the values aimed at, and the meaning of the act with its content. The fact is that the politician, contrary to the scientist and the artist, although the element of failure which he assumes is much more outrageous, is very rarely concerned with making use of it. May it be that there is an irresistible dialectic of power wherein morality has no place? Is the ethical concern, even in its realistic and concrete form, detrimental to the interests of action? The objection will surely be made that hesitation and misgivings only impede victory, since in any case there is an element of failure in all success. Since the ambiguity at any rate must be surmounted, why not refuse to take notice of it? It's pretty funny. And then down here is an important one. She says, vigilance alone can keep alive the validity of the goals and the genuine assertion of freedom. Like at the end of the day, there isn't a way that we can automate this. We can't all adopt some belief that then protects vigilance so that our creativity as a species is unaffected by these various different, you don't even really want to call them evil, but by these various different evils that sort of arise. And actually, let's see. Do we have a definition of evil? Is that what we've come to here? I think maybe we do. What do you think about that? Is that a good definition of evil? When we brought this up in, I believe, the first video, and we discussed evil for existentialism, I was a little puzzled by that. It just goes to show how much we have to gain by doing the deep reading on these books and by diving all the way in and putting in the effort to really and truly understand exactly what's going on here. Because I had read this book, I think, at least 3 times, and I had never really noticed evil. In fact, I've been reading existential stuff all year, and I've never really noticed that evil had much of a place in it. And so this may be something that's somewhat unique to Beauvoir here. And it may be something that's not really even studied, because it's one of those things that you read and it kind of clicks and you're like, okay, and you just kind of move on. And then she says something that's a little more outlandish, and that's what you focus on, and that's what all the scholars are focusing on. But I think if we say that the suppression of freedom, or oppression, as she said earlier, is what evil is, then I think we have a great reason to be talking about, for example, the Holocaust. I think we have a great reason to be talking about Stalin. But instead of pointing the finger at her, at these examples of evil, the way that people tend to do when they use that term, she's kind of just nodding and saying, yeah, that's evil. It's bad because of these concrete reasons. It's bad because it does this to us. So we shouldn't do that. And she's more preoccupied with making the argument that we should avoid certain actions than she is, really obsessed with sort of the hand waving, you're evil. She doesn't bother at all with that. it couldn't be less important to de Beauvoir. And that just, I mean, my respect for this philosopher just continues to grow. I mean, her stock is going way up in my book. But yeah, let's just, sorry, I didn't highlight it, but this paragraph here has some important stuff here. She says, indeed, on the one hand, it would be absurd to oppose a liberating action with the pretext that it implies crime and tyranny, for without crime and tyranny, there could be no liberation of man. What does that sound like? Anybody remember the protests this summer and the looters, so to speak, that were supposed to just completely invalidate the fact that everybody was protesting because they were doing they were doing bad stuff, right? So funny. But anyway, she says, indeed, on the one hand, it would be absurd to oppose a liberating action with the pretext that it implies crime and tyranny, for without crime and tyranny, there could be no liberation of man. One cannot escape that dialectic, which goes from freedom to freedom through dictatorship and oppression. So shit happens, right? I mean, that's the point there. And then she says, but on the other hand, he would be guilty of allowing the liberating movement to harden into a moment which is acceptable only if it passes into its opposite. Tyranny and crime must be kept from triumphantly establishing themselves in the world. The conquest of freedom is their only justification, and the assertion of freedom against them must therefore be kept alive. So when we find what's life-affirming and what's freeing for us, there is sort of a common ground, right? And these things that we thought of in the past as evil, right? Among the things that we did and among the things that other people did, that which has in some sense been called out as evil or as oppression, those are the things that are going to tend to be immoral. So we don't need an ethics book to tell us that. We already know that. What Beauvoir has done here is she's provided this sort of overarching framework which proves more or less indisputably that freedom is the most important thing. I mean, without freedom, right? You don't have humanity. You have maybe a robot if you've got understanding with no freedom, or maybe you have a slave if you have no freedom but no understanding, right? And the unfortunate thing is that people do these things to each other, right? And nobody thought that these things were justifiable in any real sense before Beauvoir wrote this book. It's not like she had to make a really strong argument and convince everybody that what is bad is bad, right? Instead, she is more concerned with the sort of layout. You know, she is in the mountains, heading off the bandits at the past, so that they can't come in and oppress us anymore. She's anticipating their actions and sharing the information that she learns with us, so that we can make better decisions in the future with regard to these particular hurdles and obstacles that we face in our attempt to be free, that is, to be moral. So, looking through the conclusion here, this is just going to take another minute or two. I recognize that we're at 2.5 hours since we started this thing, so we got to get done, but we got a little bit more time, and this is only a couple of pages long here. So let's go ahead and just do justice to the conclusion here. She says, is this kind of ethics individualistic or not? And she says, yes, if one means by that it accords to the individual an absolute value, and that it recognizes in him alone the power of laying the foundations of his own existence. So boom. I mean, this is individualistic. And And she says it is individualism in the sense in which the wisdom of the ancients, the Christian ethics of salvation, and the Kantian ideal of virtue also merit this name. It is opposed to the totalitarian doctrines which raise up beyond man the mirage of mankind, but it is not solipsistic, since the individual is defined only by his relationship to the world and to other individuals. He exists only by transcending himself, and his freedom can be achieved only through the freedom of others. He justifies his existence by a movement which, like freedom, springs from his heart, but which leads outside him. This individualism does not lead to the anarchy of personal whim. Man is free, but he finds his law in his very freedom. First, he must assume his freedom and not flee it by a constructive movement. One does not exist without doing something, and also by a negative movement which rejects oppression for oneself and others. And it's just impossible to overstate the importance of that clause, and others, in this text. I believe Johnny Cash wore black because people who were not him were in jail. And that concept is the same here for Beauvoir. As long as anyone is not free, none of us are completely free, right? So we have to will that for each other as well as for ourselves. When we get around to talking through The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper, the purpose of that will become even more clear than it already is here. And so there's not really like an end to this. There's no particular goal aside from everyone being able to choose their own goal for Beauvoir in the writing of this book and in the understanding of this ethics. And she closes with this statement. She says, there's a very old saying which goes, do what you must, come what may. That amounts to saying in a different way that the results is not external to the good which fulfills itself in aiming at it. If it came to be that each man did what he must, existence would be saved in each one without there being any need of dreaming of a paradise where all would be reconciled in death. Okay. So when we think about ethics, one of the things that comes up sometimes is Christianity, and there are a lot of comedians who say things like, if the only thing that's keeping you from like murdering, raping, looting, killing, yada yada, is the idea that there's an invisible man in the sky who's going to punish you later, then you're not really the type of person I want to be friends with, right? I don't do those things because it isn't me. It isn't the thing that I want to do. That's not how I want to live my life, right? And I have reasons besides possible punishments that could come to me if I did behave in that way for my aversion to those types of behaviors, right? So at the end of the day, what Beauvoir has to say here is beautiful. It really is something that's special. It's unique. A text that reaches this deep inside in the ethical discipline is almost just completely unheard of. And having read it now and studied it, I think I understand why that is. A lot of times people want what we had written on the board yesterday, which is the reductive mechanistic account of the simple way that things are. And this book is not that. This book is a book that I highly encourage you to go pick up a copy and, frequently for as long as it takes, sit down with it, read through it, and understand it as deeply and as charitably, I guess you might say, as you possibly can, because this is a book that's designed to help you make yourself a better person. And really, I feel like it just has to be something that's central to ethics because it does have that concrete utility. It does have the principles that you need to be able to make progress against that sort of a goal. But it doesn't really have the type of black and white principle or the sort of I don't know. I want to say the failure to be able to really reduce it. That's so popular in normative ethics and in the philosophy classroom today. So I do think this is a great place to start a project like Underground Philosophy, where our goal is to spend the time that we need to spend studying these texts and studying these ideas to become better, to develop our understandings of these concepts and to make better decisions ourselves in the future and to be happier and to understand what other people need from us. And I mean, really, this is an undertaking that should be worth it for everyone. It should make your life better. You should get what you want more often. People should like you more. It doesn't hurt you to pick up ethics and start to try to live ethically. And I don't care who you are or what you do for a job. I mean, if you're in sales, if you're in marketing, even if you do conceive of your job as an occupation in which you are employed in something like a deceptive enterprise, then maybe there's conflict, but I don't think so. I mean, in fact, it may lead you to find a different job, which probably would be the right thing to do if you are in a situation where you feel like you're not able to be. Lawyer. Thank you, 1876 Ivanka. So I guess we've got at least 3 people that are watching the stream today. That's fantastic. That makes me very happy. Okay. Well, I guess we've got enough of an audience where we could take some questions if anybody's got one. Anybody want to type up a question or have anything else that we need to chat about before this stream is about done? All right. Well, Matthew with 1T, I think you're the first person that ever subscribed to this Twitch channel, so I'm glad you're enjoying listening to the subjects here. And I guess if there's no questions, then I'm going to go ahead and give it a rest, because, I mean, 2 hours and 2.5 hours is a long time to stand here and talk. Title and author. Thank you, 1876 Ivanka. Let's go ahead and throw that back up here. So this is the book. It's called Ethics of Ambiguity, and the author is Simone de Beauvoir. And then here's this ISBN, which you should be able to Google. So I'm going to go ahead and throw that in the chat here. You should be able to find this actual version of the text. Not that it's perfect or really all that high quality, just by Googling that ISBN number. You are so welcome. All right, guys, I'm going to get out of here. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I believe I'll see you tomorrow with something like a summation of what this book was about and the best sort of neat little package we can try to wrap it up into. It won't be easy, but I think we'll get there. Cheers.